All right, so you sent over this pile of info on automatic water samplers. Looks like some pretty cool stuff from Teledyne ISCO. And they definitely seem to know a thing or two about environmental monitoring. It's easy to think of water sampling as pretty basic, someone with a bucket by a river, but these automatic samplers are something else entirely.
Yeah, you got that right. It's like having a little robot scientist working out there 24/7,
Hmm.
collecting those water samples, rain or shine, and that gives us a much better idea of what's actually happening in our water systems.
Okay, so paint a picture for our listener here. Let's say you're a city. You've just spent a ton of money on a new stormwater system, and you need to figure out if it's actually working the way it's supposed to. You need data.
Right.
But if you had to send someone out there every few hours to collect samples, I mean, that would be a logistical nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. Talk about a time suck. And expensive, too. And let's face it, humans, we make mistakes. And when it comes to data, inconsistent data, well, that can lead to some pretty bad decisions. I mean, you could end up spending millions on upgrades that you don't need, or, even worse, miss a real pollution problem because you just didn't catch it at the right time.
So these automatic samplers, they kind of take the human error out of the equation, right? And looking through this material from Teledyne ISCO, it seems like they've packed these things with some pretty impressive features. First up, programmable controllers. You can basically tell the sampler exactly when you want it to grab a sample and how much you need.
That level of control, that precision, it's key to getting reliable data. We need to be able to track those pollution patterns or see if a wastewater treatment plant is actually doing its job. And the great thing about those programmable controllers is that they can adapt to different needs. Maybe you need hourly samples during a storm, but then you only need daily samples when things are calm.
Okay, now this is where things start to get really interesting. They've got these samplers with telemetry systems built right in. So these things can, like, send you a text message or email with updates on what they're collecting. So is it actually like sending a text? What kind of information can these things send back?
Well, it's sort of like a text message, but for water data. The sampler can send back things like the time the sample was taken, the volume collected, even things like water temperature. You can keep an eye on everything remotely. You're not in the dark. And if something happens, if there's a sudden spike in pollution levels, you know right away and you can take action.
Okay, hold on a sec. Before we go any further, can we just clarify what a pollution event actually is? I mean, we keep mentioning it, but I want to make sure that our listener is totally clear on what we're talking about.
Good point. It's easy to assume everyone knows what we're talking about, but yeah, let's define it. A pollution event. Think of it like a sudden burst of contaminants entering the water. It could be a discharge from a factory that goes above its permitted limit, or even just a big rainstorm that washes oil and other pollutants off the streets. It's really important to catch those events to understand how pollution actually impacts things and where it's coming from.
So these automatic samplers are like our 2047 pollution detectives, always on the case, ready to catch those events in action. Now, there's this other bit of tech mentioned here that sounds super sciencey: peristaltic pumps. Break it down for me. What makes them so special?
Peristaltic pumps, oh, they're the unsung heroes of accurate sampling. They work by squeezing the tubing, kind of like if you were squeezing toothpaste out of a tube, right? And that's how they draw the water in and then push it through the system. And what's great about that is it keeps the sample completely isolated from any moving parts in the pump itself. And that prevents contamination, contamination that could really mess up your results.
So no more bits of metal or oil from the pump mixing in with your water sample. That's definitely a plus. And from what I'm seeing here, it looks like these samplers are used all over the place.
Oh yeah, you'll find them everywhere. Cities use them, of course, to keep tabs on their water systems, see what's going on with stormwater runoff. Scientists use them for those long-term research projects, studying how things like climate change are affecting water quality. And they're also vital in places like wastewater treatment plants, making sure that the water going back into the environment is clean and safe.
So basically, if you care about water, if you care about water quality, then you probably care about automatic water samplers too. They might not be flashy, but they're doing some really important work behind the scenes.
Absolutely. They give us the information we need to make smart decisions about water, which is one of our most precious resources, right? They're like our eyes and ears out in the environment, constantly gathering intel so we can understand and protect our water. And, all that data, it really does have an impact. You mentioned cities earlier. Imagine a city trying to figure out where pollution is coming from in a river, right? These automatic samplers, they can provide just this constant stream of information, helping them pinpoint a problem area,
Yeah.
maybe a specific outfall or something like that. And that lets them come up with solutions, targeted solutions, saves time, saves money, and ultimately helps protect the environment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But, I do have to wonder about the cost of all this. I mean,
Yeah.
this tech, it can't be cheap, can it? Wouldn't it be cheaper in the long run to just, send someone out there to do it the old-fashioned way?
Well, it's true. The upfront cost of one of these automatic samplers, it's going to be higher than just a simple bucket and some waders, right? But here's the thing. Those manual samples, they add up too, and not just in labor costs. You also have to think about the potential for errors, missed events, things like that.
Okay, yeah, good point about saving money. But what about maintenance? These things are out there in the elements, exposed to the weather, maybe even wildlife. Do they need a lot of upkeep? Could that end up canceling out some of the cost benefits?
It's a valid concern, for sure. Any piece of equipment out there is going to require some maintenance. But these manufacturers, they've really put a lot of effort into making these things durable and reliable. I mean, they're built to withstand some pretty harsh conditions. And a lot of models even have self-cleaning features, so you don't need to be out there messing with them all the time.
So it's kind of like investing in a high-quality car. The sticker price might be higher up front, but it's going to last longer, and you won't be shelling out for repairs as often.
That's a perfect analogy. And when you consider the value of the data these samplers provide, I mean, the return on investment really starts to become clear. Think about it this way. Would you rather base decisions about water management, important decisions, on a few sporadic manual samples that could be full of errors, or on this continuous stream of accurate, reliable data?
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the big picture here. These automatic samplers, they're not just some cool new gadget,
Yeah.
They're really an investment in protecting our water. So let's say our listener is convinced, right? They're ready to jump in. How do they go about actually choosing the right sampler for what they need?
That's where things get really interesting. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, unfortunately. It's kind of like planning a camping trip. You wouldn't bring a tiny little tent if you're going to be out there for a week, right? You have to choose the right equipment for the job.
So what are some of the key questions our listeners should be thinking about?
Well, the first thing is location. I mean, where is this sampler actually going to be used? Is it going to be in a busy city or out in the middle of nowhere or somewhere in between? That's going to determine a lot of things like how it's powered, what kind of security you need, even what materials it's made out of.
That's like real estate.
Yeah.
Location, location, location.
Exactly. And then you have to think about the water itself. What kind of water are we talking about here? Is it stormwater runoff, industrial discharge, groundwater, drinking water? Each type of water is different, right? It has its own unique characteristics, different contaminants, and that's going to affect how you preserve the samples and what kind of sensors you need.
I'm guessing you can't just scoop some water into any old jar and call it a day.
Nope. Some samples have to be kept at a very specific temperature. Some need preservatives to prevent chemical reactions. Some can't even be exposed to light. It's pretty complicated.
Wow, that's incredible. So much goes into getting a truly accurate sample. So what else do we need to consider?
The next big one is how much data do we actually need? Are we trying to get a general sense of water quality, or are we looking for very specific events like those pollution spikes we talked about? How often we need to take samples, how much water we need, that's going to make a big difference in what kind of equipment we choose.
So finding that sweet spot.
Right.
Not too much data, not too little, just the right amount to get the answers you need.
Exactly. And of course, we have to be realistic about the budget. Automatic samplers, they can range in price from a few $1,000s to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the bells and whistles you need. You got to find the right balance between what you need and what you can afford.
So it sounds like choosing the right sampler is a little bit like putting a puzzle together.
Yeah.
You get all these different pieces: location, water type, data needs, budget, and you have to find a way to make them all fit.
That's a great way to put it. And, there's no shame in asking for help. Companies like Teledyne ISCO, they have teams of engineers and scientists who can walk you through all the options and help you pick the best sampler for your needs.
Okay, so we've covered location, water type, data needs, budget. Anything else we need to think about?
Well, there's the question of how this sampler is going to fit in with everything else. Does it have to connect to other sensors or data logging systems? What about data management? How are we going to collect the data, store it, analyze it? All that has to be figured out, and it can definitely affect the cost and complexity of the whole system.
So it's not just about the sampler itself. It's about how it works with the rest of the team, the whole monitoring ecosystem.
Exactly. And that's where things get even cooler because you can combine these samplers with other technology to create these really powerful monitoring systems, that whole more than buckets and rivers idea we were talking about earlier.
All right, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these combinations. What can we do when we start thinking outside the box, outside the sampler box? Okay, so you were saying how we can combine these samplers with other tech. What are some of the possibilities there?
Well, think about this. You take an automatic sampler and you pair it with a flow meter. That gives you a whole other layer of data. You're not just getting those samples anymore, you're also measuring how much water is actually moving through that system.
So it's like we've added, I don't know, a speedometer to our bucket. We're not just seeing what's in the water, but how fast it's going. That could be really useful for understanding how pollutants spread, right?
Exactly. And it can get even more sophisticated. We can use sensors that detect specific things in the water, things like pH or dissolved oxygen or even certain chemicals. And when those sensors detect something out of the ordinary, maybe a sudden drop in dissolved oxygen or something like that, well, they can actually trigger the sampler to take an extra sample right then and there.
Wow, that's pretty cool. It's like having a real detective on the case, constantly watching for any suspicious activity in the water. We're not just sitting back and collecting samples, we're reacting in real time.
That's what's so great about all this technology. It lets us be proactive, not reactive. And of course, all this data we're collecting wouldn't be very useful if we couldn't actually do something with it.
Right, so we've got all this data coming in. What do we do with it all?
Well, luckily, there are some really amazing software platforms out there that can help us manage and analyze all that data. They can generate reports, make cool visualizations, even use machine learning to spot patterns and trends that we might not be able to see just by looking at the numbers.
So we're going from just raw data to actual insights. We're not just collecting numbers, we're actually using them to understand our water resources and make better decisions about how to protect them.
Exactly. It's all about using technology not just to keep an eye on things, but to understand and manage our water in a way that's sustainable.
Well, I have to say, I'm pretty impressed with these automatic water samplers. They may not be the most exciting pieces of tech out there, but they're really making a big difference when it comes to protecting our water.
I couldn't agree more. They really show what we can do when we put our minds to solving environmental challenges.
I think as we wrap up this deep dive, the big takeaway is that these samplers, they're way more than just buckets in a river. They're a vital part of this complex system that lets us monitor, understand, and protect our water in a way that just wouldn't have been possible even a few decades ago.
And as technology keeps developing, I'm sure these samplers are just going to become even more sophisticated and play an even bigger role in keeping our planet's most precious resource healthy.
One last thought for our listeners out there. We spent all this time talking about how these samplers help us manage water. But what about the impact on the ecosystems themselves? I mean, do these samplers change the environment they're in at all? It's something to think about as you continue exploring the amazing world of water. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.